Well, I'm joined in the studio now by Mackenzie, Chief Executive of Demos and former advisor to Nick Clegg, Tom Harwood, who's a reporter for Guido Fawkes, Miatta Fahnbulleh, the Chief Executive of the New Economics Foundation, and Helen Thomas, a former advisor to George Osborne. And we've got the Newsnight whiteboard here. So before we discuss the impact of the new Prime Minister in the next few months, let's get our panel to make their prediction for the weeks ahead. They've all said that they think that Boris Johnson is going to win the election, so for the sake of this discussion, let's assume that's going to be the case. But what then happens next? You tell us what your predictions are likely to be for the next few days, because it's going to be a crucial few weeks when, as soon as the new Prime Minister enters number 10.
Right, so Boris ends up in number 10. He totals off to Europe to renegotiate, but because he's not willing to do anything sensible like offer EEA membership or a Norway deal, he gets absolutely nothing because of Theresa May's red lines. So he faces a no-confidence vote. There's enough Conservatives who've said they won't back a party that is explicitly in favour of no deal. The no-confidence vote wins, and in pity, the European Union grants us an extension, during which we have a general election. The general election, all four of the big parties win 150 MPs. We end up with a hung parliament that can't decide anything and make absolutely no progress at all.
All right, well, that's that's one cheery view. Tom, do you tell us what you think is going to happen?
Right, I'm going to peddle some more optimism in the infamous words of Jeremy Hunt. Boris wins. We attempt a renegotiation with Europe. Initially, they say no, but because we're leaving no deal on the table as that credible threat, eventually, at the last possible minute, some concessions are granted, particularly around the Irish backstop. And that leads to a new deal being presented to Parliament, which, with the help of about 30 Labour, not quite rebels, but people supporting that vote, and the 10 crucial DUP MPs, the new deal passes. So we leave the European Union on the 31st of October. And then Prime Minister Boris Johnson is governing the country, but at this point he has a working majority in the House of Commons of just 3 MPs. Governing becomes almost impossible. He calls a general election and delivers the first decent Tory majority since 1987.
That's one view, but we've got 2 more counter scenarios to go. Who's next?
OK.
Miatta, you tell us how you think it's going to play out.
So, we'll have Prime Minister Boris Johnson. He will try and renegotiate a deal with Europe, but because he's boxed himself in by saying he won't accept a backstop and the EU won't budge, he'll fail. We'll be staring down the barrel of a no deal. And in that scenario, Parliament will try and stop a no deal through a vote of no confidence. The vote of no confidence, however, will fail because when confronted with the reality of bringing down their own government and the political ramifications of that, Tory rebels will choose to back their government, but on the condition that the government puts forward a second referendum. We'll see an extension of Article 50. We'll have a second referendum in which no deal or remain will be on the ballot box, with Boris Johnson campaigning for no deal and the Labour Party campaigning for a second referendum. And when confronted with those 2 choices, the country will opt to remain.
OK, so complete odds with what Tom told us. Helen, you lay out your scenario for us, and then we're going to compare all of them and see if we can work out what the next 3 months might really hold.
So, yes, Boris off to Brussels. Renegotiation. He is, of course, the consummate salesman. So whatever he manages to thrash out, he will claim it is a new form of the deal. But it will all hinge on this Irish backstop, and it probably will just be cosmetic. So he gets his renegotiation, comes back to Parliament, puts a new deal in front of them. But it won't still quite be enough, particularly for the DUP. That doesn't pass. So now what happens is we tick forwards with the clock towards no deal. There'll have to be a no-confidence vote. But we will see the whites of the eyes of the Conservative Party in terms of whether they're prepared to actually usher in a possible Corbyn government, and so that won't pass. And then there we are, with just probably days to go until the deadline. There is no way to stop no deal without passing a deal or revoking Article 50, neither of which will look palatable. So no deal it is. We leave October 31st, whatever happens.
Helen, thank you very much for that. So let's unpack some of that. So obviously, you all agree what is going to happen is that if Boris Johnson's the Prime Minister, he'll have to go back to Brussels and try and renegotiate something that the EU have been very clear is not up for renegotiation. Certainly the withdrawal agreement, they say, cannot be reopened. They'll talk about the political declaration. Tom, why do you think they're going to change their mind, and why would they offer Boris Johnson something that they didn't offer Theresa May?
Of course, at this stage, they'd say that they're not going to open anything up. They've got a deal that suits them very nicely. It's why it's been rejected 3 times in our parliament. It's heavily in favour of the European Union and not very good for our country. The European Union, although all that's true, the European Union does not want no deal. It would be really challenging for Ireland. 60% of Ireland's trade is reliant on the UK. It would be really challenging for countries like Germany that are teetering on the brink of recession right now.
OK, but even if you said they do open the withdrawal agreement, what on earth could they agree on the Irish backstop that wasn't agreed before?
Well, there are lots of things that weren't even asked for by Theresa May. She didn't go into these negotiations with the same spirit of saying, we are going to go for no deal. She didn't believe in no deal. She didn't believe in her own slogans. Having that, having a Prime Minister who is able to say, we are leaving deal or no deal, gives a new impetus to those talks. The Europeans are probably going to say something along the lines of, we'll give you a time limit on the backstop, we're going to change this in a way that we're going to work positively towards alternative arrangements. That could be sellable.
Miatta, you don't think a scenario like this can come about. Why are you so sure that he will fail in a renegotiation?
Well, because I think he's boxed himself in. I think by being so bullish about the fact that he will leave on the 31st of October, do or die, I think the fact that he's basically said he won't accept the backstop means he has so little room to manoeuvre. So in the end, the backstop will have to be dealt with in some way. He won't be able to sell it in Parliament. He won't be able to sell it to his own side. The EU are not going to budge on it because in the end, it's their insurance policy. There will be talk of alternative arrangements. We've seen the working group of an alternative arrangement. For the EU, they will say, great, you've got an alternative arrangement. You don't need to be scared of the backstop. It's an insurance policy, but because of your alternative arrangements, we know we'll negotiate something. Let's crack on, to which he won't be able to get his side to agree to. And so in the end, we will have the impasse that we've had for the last year.
But the key thing you said there was, will he be able to sell it? And that could very well be the difference, isn't it? That Boris Johnson can sell to the hard Brexiteers, to the European Research Group and some others, something that maybe isn't that different from Theresa May's deal, but because it's him, he can get it through.
I think that is possible, and some people have been looking for a ladder to climb down, and he will at least provide them with that. The toughest sticking point, as I mentioned, is still the DUP. However, we do have, potentially there's even 26 Labour rebels who've signed this letter to their leader, and of course party discipline's broken down across the board. We really have to go in and look at what is each individual's MP's calculation. I like to say that, the parliamentary arithmetic hasn't changed, but the individual calculation has. Having said that, it's still going to be very difficult for the consummate salesman to get it done.
And, Paula, you don't think he can come up with something that's saleable?
No, and I think it's because the European Union fundamentally values its rules-based system and approach. They had that PowerPoint presentation that they sort of set out that looked at the red lines Theresa May had set out and said, well, if you want to satisfy all of those red lines, then the only option that's available to you is basically Canada. And our view, as the United Kingdom, was that that wasn't good enough for our economy because it doesn't give us good enough access to the single market. Now, the problem is we assume that the European Union is going to rewrite its rules for us because we're leaving. And I find it sort of unfathomable that the Tory Brexiteers, who believe that sovereignty, a rules-based system, is more important than economics, can't understand that the Europeans think exactly the same, that their rules, their sovereignty is more important than economics, and they will suck up the pain of a no deal. They are much, much more prepared than we are, even though, as Tom rightly says, they don't want it, but they will accept it because protecting the European Union's integrity is, in their view, the most important ballast against the rise of strongman politics from Putin.
Now, Tom, of course, one of the things that will have changed is the character of the person there. And you think that that's going to change things for the better, that somebody who's going to go in with a more bombastic attitude. But this is not a details man. We know this because he can't even work out the details of how kippers are sold from the Isle of Man correctly and whether they're subject to EU regulations. He doesn't know what clauses of the GATT treaty he wants to use in order to try and trade with the EU. We've got a potential Iranian crisis coming up, and we know he's put his foot in it before when it comes to diplomatic relations with Iran. Is this really somebody who can move the dial in Brussels?
It's precisely because he's unpredictable that he can move that dial. It's the Nixonian madman strategy. The Europeans, just like the Russians then, need to know that he would press the button. They need to think that he's erratic. They need to think that he would be willing to do anything to ensure no deal. And only then will they think, hang on, this is a real threat, this could happen, we don't want this to happen, and therefore we're going to change our tack.
Miatta?
It's a real threat, but, you know, let's be clear, no deal would be an absolute disaster for this country. It will be a disaster because it will be a hit to the economy. So, you know, the government's own watchdog has come out and, you know, you can shake your head and say these are fantasy numbers, but every credible economist will tell you that there will be a hit to the economy.
But we're talking here about what the new Prime Minister Johnson might do. He doesn't believe that it would be a hit to the economy, so he's possible he would do it.
But MPs do. And in the end, Brussels knows that we have a parliament that is sensible enough to look at the facts, to look at the evidence, to look at the expertise and say, this is bad for our country, it is bad for the future of this country, we will not make this happen. And because they know they have that, they will stand there to the 11th hour. There will be an awful game of brinkmanship, awful for both sides, quite frankly. But in the end, when confronted with that, we will blink. Our MPs will blink and they will force the government's hand.
They can't.
But it can't be done without some kind of electoral event, do you think, whether it's a general election or a second referendum?
Well, I just take on this point about the MPs. Something significant has changed since March 31st passed without us leaving. As we saw in the European election results, there is now, as Polly mentioned, a four-way tie, really, which is pretty much unprecedented, not supposed to happen in our political system. And if you think about how David Cameron was panicked by the rise of UKIP as the Tories dropped a few points to the 32% in the polls, how do you think the Conservative Party feels going from 40% to 28% in the polls? Because we passed through that date and we haven't left. So there is now an existential crisis within the Conservative Party that the MPs are going to have to address, which, although they may have an economic understanding, the political angle, you know, is potentially almost suicidal, which they have to now confront, which I think is potentially will change people's calculations.
And also means that Boris Johnson can be confident he would survive a vote of no confidence because turkeys won't vote for Christmas, essentially. Tory MPs won't vote for a general election.
Yeah, I think the MPs do not want a general election, but there are enough MPs who would do anything to stop no deal and the economic catastrophe. And in the end, they might trigger a general election rather than see that happen, allow a vote of no confidence. The alternative is you have a vote of no confidence and then Parliament tries to install an alternative Prime Minister. And even though I kind of feels like a fantastic novel and people talk about, oh, you could sort of resurrect Ken Clarke to be the Prime Minister, or maybe Yvette Cooper. And it's nice to play fantasy politics. I think that in the end just kind of is too impossible in our tribal political system. And a general election, which will solve nothing, will somehow be pushed through nevertheless.
OK, quick yes-no round. Will Boris Johnson still be Prime Minister this time next year, Helen?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, and with a majority.
No.
OK. All right. Thank you very much. That's almost it for tonight. Emily will be back on Monday.